So in week two for biology, we're going to cover both fish and amphibians in these two phylum. So let's start with fish for today. Fish are going to be, once again, part of kingdom Animalia. Phylum Chordata. This is now going to be a phylum that will stay in for quite a ways. Chordata, we'll talk later on, but that means that they have data cords or backbones. But if we're looking at the characteristics of fish, the first characteristic that they have is they have gills. And they use these gills in order to obtain oxygen from the water. They need some way of breathing underwater, and these gills allow for them to do that. If we were to look closer at the gills, those gills are going to be actually made up of what we call gill filaments. These gill filaments are going to be little hair-like or finger-like projections that come up or make up the gill. And what they do is they allow for a better use or better way of oxygen getting into the bloodstream. And in order for the fish to get water over their gills, what they'll do is they'll usually either open their mouth and allow for water to come in through their mouth and then flow over their gills and exit through an opening known as a gill slot. A gill slot is going to be at the end or the rear of the cheek cavity, and once again it allows for that water that goes through the mouth to then wash over the gills, allows for the blood to then become oxygenated from the oxygen in the water, and the water then to exit out the gill slot. What's cool is that fish actually have what is known as countercurrent flow. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about the book lung of the spiders last week. They also had countercurrent flow, which means that once again the water is going to pass over the gills in one direction. However, the blood inside those gills is going to flow in the opposite direction. And what that means is the blood is now going to be exposed to the water for a longer period of time, and thus allow for more time for that oxygen to fuse into the gills. This makes it super efficient and allows for fish to easily get that oxygen into their bloodstream. Here's kind of what that looks like once again. So you have your fish on the top right hand corner. Water is going to flow into the mouth, and then it's going to flow over those gills and then exit out the gill slot. And our gills themselves are going to be made up of several of these branches with those gill filaments that branch off of that. The finger-like projections allows for more surface area to be exposed now to that oxygen or that water. And then once again, the blood is going to flow in one direction and become oxygenated, and then the water is going to flow in the opposite direction and become deoxygenated as the blood takes the oxygen out of it. Second characteristic of our fish is they have a single loop blood circulation. It's now going to be a closed circulatory system, kind of similar to that of our arthropods and our squid and our octopi. Okay, the heart is going to carry the blood from the heart, I guess, then to the capillaries in the gills, where it then becomes oxygenated. We just saw that on the last slide. Then it's going to get carried to the rest of the body. That oxygen is going to get carried to the muscles that need it, and then it's going to flow back to the heart as deoxygenated blood. So once again, blue blood is going to be deoxygenated, so the heart only handles deoxygenated blood, pumps it to the gills to become oxygenated, and then it will cycle its way back from the muscles and the capillaries in the muscles back to the heart, where it then is going to be pumped again to the gills to get more oxygen. Third characteristic of our fish is they have our vertebral column. I told you earlier in the phylum, this is where our chordata, once again, means data cord or backbone. This is where they're going to get that structure. In order to protect their data cord, they have this vertebral column. The skeleton can actually be made up of cartilage, similar to what's on the tip of your nose or your ears, or it can also be made up of bone. But both are going to still surround the spinal cord, act as a protective layer in order to protect that spinal cord as well. The brain is going to then be surrounded by what is known as a cranium or skull, and this is going to be a more bony protective layer for, once again, the brain, or the more advanced brain that we have now. The fifth characteristic is going to be the heart. There's a simple chambered pump heart. We looked at that earlier, but this actually has 4 chambers. Those 4 chambers, you're going to need to know a little bit about each one. The first one is the sinus virosus. This is actually going to form as a collective chamber. It allows for the reduced resistance of the blood then to flow into the rest of the heart. As the heart pumps its blood and it goes throughout the rest of the body, it's doing this with quite a bit of force. And so that blood returns to the heart with similar force, and thus it would continue to speed up the blood would. And so this kind of slows down that blood, allows for it to collect back into the heart where it then can be pushed out, and doesn't allow for this cycle to speed up too quickly. The atrium is going to be located right after that. It's going to be a large chamber with muscular walls. This leads then to the ventricle, which is going to be your thick-walled pump. You'll see that on the next slide. It pumps the blood over the gills and the rest of the body. And then at the very end, we have what is known as the conus arteriosus, which is a secondary pump. And what its job is to do is, because the ventricle is so good at pumping the blood, it is actually going to smooth out that pumping, and so that the blood has less pulsations and adds a little bit more force to it, but it's going to be acting more of a smooth or smoothing that blood out. So you can look here. We have the sinus venosus. This is what's going to collect the blood from the rest of the body, slow it down, allow for it to pass into the atrium. You can see the ventricle then is going to have this thick muscular wall. All this light color here is actually the muscular wall. It's going to force that blood out. That's our main pump. And it's going to pump it to the conus arteriosus, which then will pulse out or take out the pulsations and allow for a smoother blood flow throughout the rest of the body. The sixth characteristic of our fish is going to be the fact that they have a kidney. What is kind of cool about fish is that although they live in water, their body is also 2/3 water, or made up of 2/3 of water. And so the kidney actually helps reduce water loss. You wouldn't think about it, but fish actually have to still find a way to keep the water that they have within their body there. And so what you'll find is that the kidney helps with this process. Marine fish have a little bit different problem than freshwater fish. Fish are going to be losing water to their surroundings through osmosis. If you think about it, it's kind of like we go back to the egg lab, putting the egg in the syrup, and what would happen there. Okay, and so what's going to happen is these fish will actually actively have to drink the water from their surroundings. And what they do is then they will filter out the ions or the salts that are in the water, and then they'll allow for them to continue to collect water, but then filter out those ions. And so what you'll see is that these guys will actually have a small amount of urine that they'll secrete out, and it's usually going to be very concentrated. The ammonia is also going to be released through their gills, which allows for them to once again get out more ions out of their body. Freshwater fish have the opposite effect. It's almost like the egg going into our water. Okay, it balloons up. And so what you see these guys do is they are constantly trying to get rid of water. And so they will tend to intake too much water due to osmosis. They will actively try to take in salts from their environment. So they'll usually be eating plant life or eating food or scraping algae off rock in order to increase that salt intake. And so what happens is these freshwater fish will actually excrete large amounts of diluted urine, and that urine is going to be just their way of trying to get rid of any water that they can, keeping them from blowing up in the water. So here's kind of a picture showing that to you once again. So let's go to the marine on the right. This is the first one we talked about. What you'll see is they will actively intake seawater, which contains both the ions and the water, and they'll also take in food. And so what they're constantly doing is they're losing water from their body to the ocean surrounding them. Okay, it's less concentrated water outside. And so we know from high to low, for osmosis, the water is going to flow from inside the fish to outside the fish. And so what you'll see is they will have a very concentrated urine. They'll lose a little bit of water from that, but it's mostly going to be made up of ions. Freshwater fish have the opposite effect. Okay, they're going to be taking in food any which way they can because they're actively trying to get rid of the water that they have. So what you'll see with these fish is that diffusion will take place. There's a higher concentration on the outside, lower concentration on the inside, so water flows into the fish. Okay, and diffusion will also take place in the gills. Water will be taken in there as well. And so what you'll see is they will have very diluted urine. Much more urine going to be made, but it's also going to be more diluted as well. So how do fish reproduce? There's actually going to be separate sexes for fish. Most will have external fertilization known as spawning. This is where the females will release the eggs into the water, and the males will actually come swim over the eggs and release their sperm. What this allows for is a large amount of eggs to be released, and hopefully increasing their odds of those eggs reaching maturity, developing, and into the next generation of fish. There are other groups of fish that will have different methods for reproduction. Sharks, skates, and rays will all have internal fertilization. What you'll find is that on these sharks, skates, and rays, they have what are known as claspers, which are going to be the two male organs that are used in order to insert the sperm into the female. And so the female usually does not have any claspers. So you can see over here, here would be the two claspers. Female does not have that. And so this will lead to internal fertilization. This also can lead to live birth, except there's going to be a couple species of shark, such as the zebra shark, this guy on the right side over here, that can actually, from that, lay a fertilized egg, and then that egg will develop from there. So let's talk about the three classes of fish. The first class is going to be Agnatha. This is going to be our jawless fish. This consists of both our lampreys and our hagfish. What you'll find with this group is that they will live on the bottom of the ocean floor, usually up to a mile down. They have cartilaginous skeletons, and what you'll see for both these groups is they almost kind of look like eels. Hagfish are going to be the scavengers of the sea. It's almost like the vultures of the sea is what their nickname is. And so when other fish, other animals die, their bodies drop to the bottom of the ocean, you'll usually see a lot of hagfish eating what's left over, or whatever is left over when it drops to the bottom. What you'll see is that these hagfish will also produce a slime when they are threatened, and it actually is a bad tasting slime. So hagfish aren't a good fish to eat, and the predators don't like them as well because of that slime. Lampreys are parasitic, so you can see there in the two pictures below, they actually have these suction-like structures for mouths used to attach to their host. And what they have inside that mouth is going to be a tongue with several teeth on it, used in order to basically cut out a fresh hole out of that their host, and then take blood from their host in that way as well. So lampreys and hagfish are going to be our members of Agnatha. Class Chondrichthyes is going to be our cartilaginous fish. This is once again going to be our sharks, skates, and our rays. Cartilaginous fish have skeletons once again made up of cartilage and calcium carbonate. Once again, that's the tip of your nose and your ears. So it's lightweight, it's flexible, and so what you'll see is that although this provides a little bit more strength for the skeleton, it also allows for them to have very quick movements and makes them into great predators. Sharks, in order to identify those, obviously they have light, streamlined bodies. They have what are a rough skin to them, which are known as placoid scales. If you ever were to pet a shark or touch the side of it, it almost just feels like sandpaper, and that's those placoid scales, those cone-shaped rough scales. What scientists believe is that their teeth are actually just modified scales because they can replace those teeth so often throughout their lifetime. They usually have about 6 to 10 rows around the jaw and over 20,000 feet or 20,000 teeth throughout their lifetime. Their front teeth are going to be the most pointed and sharp, and these are obviously going to be used for biting and cutting or ripping off sections of their prey. Skates and rays are going to be identified by their flattened bodies. They are adapted for living on the sea floor. rays are usually going to be a bit bigger, usually around the 1 meter range, a little bit bigger than that. And then anything lower than that is going to be classified as a skate. The great manta ray, which is in the bottom left-hand corner, that's actually going to get over 7 meters long from wingspan to wingspan. They contain flattened teeth that are located usually at the bottom of their sides, and these are used in order to crush prey. And they like to feed on all of those shelled bivalves that we talked about earlier, and the other mollusks that would be located there as well. The last group is going to be known, or last class is going to be known as osteichthyes. This is going to be our bony fish. 95% of all the fish that we know of are going to be classified as osteichthyes. Oste, you'll see this later on when we talk more about bone structure, but oste is actually going to refer to bone. So if you've had maybe somebody in your family that has osteoporosis, osteichthyes once again refers to bony fish. Okay, so one characteristic of these guys is they actually will have a lateral line system, which is just a system of sensory cells located on the side of their body, used in order to detect position and movement in the water. When you go fishing and you're usually dragging your line, that's what you're trying to actually light up on the fish, is you're trying to make the water movement actually signals to these lateral line cells. Second characteristic that osteichthyes have is they actually have what is known as a gill cover. Most of your freshwater fish will be osteichthyes. They have this gill cover. It's called an operculum. It's a hard plate that covers the gills on each side of their head. And what this allows for the fish to do is it actually allows for them to move that bony structure, that operculum, back and forth in order to draw in water through their mouth and then over their gills. And so this allows for them to conserve energy, allows for them to actually, during the wintertime, sit at the bottom of the pond or the lake and just be able to breathe by opening and closing those gills or the gill slot using their operculum, and it allows for them to continue to breathe until once again that water temperature rises up and they become more active. Third characteristic that you'll see with the osteichthyes is they have a swim bladder. This swim bladder is a gas sac that allows for the fish to regulate their buoyancy or their depth in the water. And so what will happen is you'll see these fish without having to swim up or down. They can actually just sit there, fill their swim bladder up with air, and allows for the fish to rise in the water. And then when that air empties out, it allows for them to sink back down. So they can actually determine their position in the water using the swim bladder. Here's the fish fins. So usually most of your fish will have these, especially your osteichthyes. Probably the most identified fin is going to be the caudal fin in the back. Next to the anus will be the anal fin. The pelvic fins are going to be like where, just imagine a fish, if it had legs, would have fins at. Pectoral fin is going to be the one next to the gill slot. Okay, and then these up top will be your dorsal fins, whether it's a spinous dorsal or a soft dorsal. Okay, that's your fish notes.